The darkness crawls across the medieval landscape like a living thing. The sun has abandoned these people hours ago, and now the frost begins its nightly assault. As temperatures plummet far below freezing, a family huddles in a humble dwelling. No central heating, no insulation as we know it. No electric blankets or thermal clothing, just ingenuity, generational knowledge, and the fierce human will to survive. This is not merely discomfort they face, but death itself, stalking the shadows of winter. Yet somehow for 1,000 years, ordinary peasants endured and overcame the seasonal battle against the cold. Tonight, we uncover how the most vulnerable people in medieval society survived the deadliest nights of winter. Far from the grand stone castles and towering cathedrals that dominate our modern imagination of the Middle Ages, the vast majority of medieval people lived in humble dwellings scattered across the countryside. While nobles might shiver in their drafty stone halls, despite roaring fires and layers of fur, peasants faced a much more dire situation with far fewer resources. For them, surviving winter wasn't about comfort, it was about life and death. Czech medieval period stretched roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, and during this time, Europe experienced significant climate fluctuations. The early medieval period enjoyed the relatively warm medieval climate optimum, but by the 14th century, the continent had plunged into what historians now call the Little Ice Age. Rivers that had never frozen before regularly became solid enough to hold markets and festivals. Crop failures mounted, and each night as the sun disappeared, the cold became an immediate and pressing enemy. To understand how peasants survived requires us to step into their world, to see winter through their eyes, and to appreciate the sophistication of solutions that might appear primitive to our modern sensibilities. The first and most fundamental defense against the cold was the peasant dwelling itself. Contrary to popular belief, medieval peasant homes weren't simply crude huts thrown together without thought. They represented centuries of adaptive architecture, carefully designed to maximize heat retention while working within severe material constraints. In Northern Europe, the typical peasant home was what historians call a longhouse, a single-room structure where humans and livestock lived under the same roof. This wasn't merely a matter of convenience or space. The animals, usually cattle, pigs or sheep, were vital heating elements. A single cow can produce approximately the same heat as a small wood stove. By bringing livestock indoors, peasant families essentially created living furnaces that helped maintain survivable temperatures through the night. The arrangement seems unsanitary by modern standards, explains Dr. Eleanor Smithwick, medieval agricultural historian at Oxford University. But it was a brilliant adaptation. The body heat from even a few animals could raise the interior temperature by several crucial degrees, often the difference between survival and hypothermia during the harshest nights. The structures themselves were engineering marvels of their time, though they might appear crude to modern eyes. In woodland regions, homes were typically timber-framed with walls of wattle and daub, a mixture of wet soil, clay, sand, animal dung, and straw. This combination created a surprisingly effective insulating layer. In areas where wood was scarce, homes might be built partially underground as pit houses, using the Earth's natural insulation properties to maintain more stable temperatures. Roofs were typically thatched with locally available materials, most commonly rye straw, reeds or heather. A well-constructed thatch roof could last 15–30 years and provided excellent insulation properties. The thick layers of organic material trapped air, creating natural insulation that kept warmth in during winter and heat out during summer. Thatch has an R value comparable to modern fiberglass insulation when properly installed, notes Dr. Julian Richards, experimental archaeologist at the University of York. The density of traditional thatch creates millions of tiny air pockets that dramatically slow heat transfer. It's not just ancient technology, it's good technology. The layout of peasant homes was equally strategic. Ceilings were kept low to minimize the volume that needed heating. Windows, if they existed at all, were tiny and often covered with oiled parchment or animal bladders to allow minimal light while blocking drafts. Doors typically faced away from prevailing winds, and many homes featured a small entrance vestibule that acted as an airlock, preventing gusts of cold air from directly entering the main living space. At the heart of the medieval peasant home was the hearth, an open fire pit originally placed in the center of the single-room dwelling. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, though imperfectly. While smoky by modern standards, this arrangement maximized heat distribution within the home. By the later medieval period, some peasant homes had evolved to include rudimentary stone chimneys against one wall, though this arrangement was less efficient for heating the entire space. The central hearth was the technological and social heart of the medieval home, explains Dr. Meredith Cohen, architectural historian. It wasn't simply about heating. It was where cooking happened, where light was generated, where tools might be repaired, and where the family gathered. The smoke, while irritating to modern sensibilities, actually helped preserve the structural timbers and thatch from insect damage and rot. Fuel for these fires presented a constant challenge for peasant families. Unlike the nobility, who could command vast quantities of firewood from their forests, peasants operated under strict limitations. Many forests were royal property, and taking wood without permission constituted a serious crime. Instead, peasants relied on carefully managed fuel sources. Peasant fuel gathering was a sophisticated year-round activity, says environmental historian Dr. Paul Ward. They collected deadwood where permitted, dried animal dung, peat from bogs, gorse, and even collected specific plants like heather that burn slowly. These weren't random acts of gathering. Peasant communities had complex knowledge about which fuels burned hottest, which lasted longest, and which produced the least smoke. Archaeological evidence from medieval middens, trash heaps, confirms that peasants carefully managed their fuel. They might mix different materials, peat, wood, and dung, to achieve specific heating properties. In coastal areas, dried seaweed might be burned. In upland regions, heather and gorse were staples. In forested areas with coppicing rights, peasants mastered the art of sustainable woodland management centuries before the term existed. The precious fuel was used strategically as temperatures dropped. Many families would bank their fires at night, covering hot coals with ash to preserve them until morning without consuming precious fuel overnight. This technique allowed the fire to stay alive but burn extremely slowly, providing some radiant heat while ensuring easy relighting. Come morning, but the hearth alone wasn't enough to survive the coldest nights. Medieval peasants employed a sophisticated layering strategy for their sleeping arrangements. The medieval bed bore little resemblance to our modern concept. For most peasant families, the bed was a straw-filled mattress placed on the floor, or on a simple wooden platform. However, the bedding strategy was far more complex than this simple description suggests. Medieval peasant bedding was an intricate system, explains material culture historian Dr. Sarah Richardson. The base layer would be fresh straw, which provided insulation from the cold ground. This might be covered with a coarse cloth, then perhaps a woolen blanket if the family could afford it. The whole family typically slept together, using shared body heat as a crucial warming strategy. This communal sleeping arrangement wasn't just about warmth, though that was a primary benefit. It also reflected the lack of privacy in medieval life and the different understanding of family structures. Extended family members often shared the same sleeping space, and servants or apprentices might sleep near the hearth on simpler pallets. For additional warmth, Hot stones or ceramic containers filled with hot water might be wrapped in cloth and placed in the bed before sleeping. These medieval hot water bottles would radiate heat for hours. Some regions developed specialized bed warming, pans, metal containers on long handles that could be filled with hot coals and run between the bedding layers before sleep. We've found these warming devices in archaeological contexts spanning all social classes, notes Dr. Richardson, but peasants typically used simpler versions, heated stones or clay bricks wrapped in cloth rather than the metal warming pans depicted in later art. The bedding itself was a crucial defense against cold. While the wealthiest nobles might have fur blankets, peasants relied primarily on wool. Despite its humble reputation today, wool was the technical fabric of the medieval world. Naturally, water-resistant, insulating even when damp, and durable enough to last for years. A good woolen blanket was a treasured possession, explains textile historian Dr. Elaine Jones. Wool retains about 80% of its insulating properties even when wet, making it perfectly suited for the often damp conditions of medieval homes. Families would carefully repair and maintain these textiles, passing quality pieces down through generations. Clothing, too, played a vital role in nighttime survival. Medieval peasants didn't change into specific night clothes. Instead, they typically slept in the same linen undergarments they wore during the day, sometimes keeping on additional layers in the coldest weather. The idea of special sleepwear is relatively modern, notes costume historian Dr. Margaret Wilson. Medieval people across all social classes typically slept in their undergarments, a linen shirt or smock. In cold weather, they might sleep fully dressed or add additional layers. The practice of sleeping naked was generally associated with sin and was discouraged by church teachings. For the poorest families, additional clothing layers might consist of reused sacking cloth, patched homespun wool, or carefully maintained hand-me-downs. Nothing was wasted. Cloth was valuable enough that garments would be repeatedly repaired, resized, and repurposed before finally becoming rags for other household uses. Yet even with these adaptive strategies, the coldest nights posed extreme dangers. Evidence from medieval parish records and coroner's reports reveals that hypothermia was a recognized cause of death, particularly among the elderly and very young. The Latin term frigore mortuus, dead from cold, appears with sobering regularity in winter records from particularly harsh years. This grim reality made community a crucial survival strategy. Medieval peasant communities practiced forms of mutual aid that helped protect the most vulnerable during extreme weather. The medieval village wasn't just a collection of homes, it was a social support network, explains Dr. Christopher Dyer, professor of regional and local history. Parish records show organized systems for checking on elderly villagers during cold snaps. Communal baking ovens would be kept running during the worst weather, providing a warm gathering spot where the most vulnerable could shelter during the day. Religious institutions also played a vital role. Monasteries were often obligated to provide charity to the poor, which intensified during winter months. Some monastic records show increased distributions of firewood, food, and even temporary shelter during periods of extreme cold. We see spikes in documented charity during harsh winters, notes medieval Christianity scholar Dr. Rebecca Thomas. The Christian theological emphasis on caring for the poor translated into practical survival support. Some monasteries operated what we might now recognize as primitive warming centers, allowing the poorest community members to sleep in certain areas of the church or outbuildings during life-threatening weather. Parish churches themselves sometimes served as emergency shelters during extreme conditions. The stone construction that made churches chilly during normal circumstances also meant they warmed very slowly but retained heat longer when filled. With people for extended services, The communal nature of medieval life extended to coping mechanisms that kept spirits alive during the darkest months. Winter was a time of storytelling, of passing down oral histories, of singing, and sometimes of special feasts that broke the monotony and hardship. Winter nights were not simply endured, they were inhabited, explains folklore historian Dr. Thomas Bradley. The long darkness became a canvas for storytelling, for transmitting cultural knowledge and practical skills from one generation to the next. Many European folktales show evidence of being refined through countless winter tellings, with their narrative structures optimized for multi-night delivery. These cultural practices weren't merely entertainment, they were psychological, survival tools that built resilience and reinforced community bonds, essential for physical survival. The shared experience of enduring winter created connections that facilitated practical mutual aid. As Christianity spread throughout Europe, the church calendar provided structure to the winter months, with celebrations that offered psychological milestones, points of light in the darkness. Christmas Candlemas, February 2nd, and numerous saints' days created occasions for communal gathering and sometimes feasting, even among the poorest peasants. These religious observances weren't just spiritual events, notes medieval social historian Dr. Helena Wright. They created a psychological framework for enduring winter. Advent began a period of preparation and anticipation. The 12 days of Christmas featured numerous community celebrations. Candlemas marked the deepening of winter, but also the first hints that spring would eventually return. These weren't simply religious abstractions, they were lived experiences that helped people cope with the physical and psychological challenges of winter. The harshest winter periods brought additional challenges. During prolonged cold spells, many peasant families would consolidate living spaces even further. Internal walls might be created with hanging textiles to create smaller spaces that required less heating. In some regions, families would move their sleeping area closer to the livestock portion of the longhouse to maximize the benefit of animal body heat. We know from both archaeological evidence and surviving records that peasant families adapted their living arrangements seasonally, explains household archaeology specialist Dr. Martin Gray. What might appear to modern eyes as primitive or static dwellings were actually dynamic spaces that could be reconfigured as needed. Sleeping platforms might be temporarily relocated, internal arrangements adjusted, and daily routines modified to maximize heat efficiency. For peasants with slightly more resources, additional technological adaptations appeared during the high and late medieval periods. Box beds, enclosed sleeping spaces with curtains or wooden panels, became more common in northern Europe. These created a microclimate within the larger house, allowing body heat to warm a smaller enclosed area. In parts of Scandinavia and northern Germany, sleeping platforms were sometimes built above the livestock stalls, positioning sleepers to benefit from the rising warm air generated by the animals below. These box beds were remarkably effective, notes Dr. Gray. The enclosed space could be as much as 15 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the surrounding room. Some examples survived well into the 19th century, showing how effective the design was, even when newer heating technologies became available. The coldest regions of medieval Europe developed even more specialized strategies. In parts of Scandinavia and Iceland, homes were built with exceptionally thick walls of turf, sometimes up to 6 feet thick. These structures used the insulating properties of soil to maintain livable internal temperatures, even in the harshest conditions. In mountainous regions of Central Europe, some communities developed specialized hay bedding techniques, using the natural insulating properties of dried alpine grasses to create bedding that retained body heat with remarkable efficiency. Regional adaptations show remarkable innovation, explains environmental archaeologist Dr. Sarah Parkak. Communities didn't simply endure their local climate conditions. They developed highly specialized responses that maximized available materials. The thick turf walls of Nordic homes could maintain an interior temperature above freezing, even when exterior temperatures dropped to 30 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. The daily rhythms of peasant life also adapted to winter's challenges. Summers, extended working hours contracted as daylight diminished, but this didn't mean winter was a time of idleness. Essential outdoor chores, caring for livestock, collecting water, gathering fuel, still needed to be accomplished despite the cold. Indoor work intensified, with families focusing on repairs, textile production, and tool maintenance that couldn't be accomplished during the busy growing season. Medieval peasants had a sophisticated understanding of energy conservation, both their own and their resources, explains medieval labor historian Dr. Jordan Peterson. They planned physical activity to minimize exposure during the coldest hours. Heavy outdoor work might be concentrated during the relatively warmer midday period, with early mornings and evenings reserved for indoor tasks. This wasn't laziness, it was a calibrated strategy for survival. These activity patterns extended to fuel consumption. Cooking multiple days' worth of food at once saved precious fuel and generated extended heat during the cooking process. Meals shifted towards slow-cooked pottages and stews that could simmer for hours, efficiently using fuel while providing sustained warmth. Food preparation wasn't just about nutrition. It was part of the heating strategy, notes food historian Dr. Caroline Yeldam. A ceramic pot of slowly simmering pottage, a thick soup of grain, vegetables, and occasionally meat, might cook for hours, radiating heat throughout the dwelling. The resulting food was not only warming when consumed, but efficiently used every available calorie from the cooking fuel. Diet itself shifted during winter months. Summer's relatively varied plant foods gave way to stored staples. Grain, dried legumes, preserved meat for those who could afford it, and fermented vegetables like sauerkraut that provided crucial vitamins during the season of scarcity. Medieval peasants increased their caloric intake during winter when possible, explains historical nutritionist Dr. Emma Marshall. The body requires more energy to maintain core temperature in cold environments. A working peasant might consume between 3,000 to 4,000 calories daily during winter months, significantly more than modern recommendations for adults. These calories came primarily from grains and legumes, with fats being particularly prized for their high energy content. Archaeological evidence from cesspit analysis confirms these seasonal dietary shifts. Winter waste shows higher concentrations of grain remnants and animal bones, suggesting a heavier reliance on energy-dense foods during cold months. The bones themselves often show evidence of extended cooking, being cracked to extract marrow and then boiled repeatedly to extract every possible calorie. This nutritional strategy extended to drinking habits as well. While clean water remained, the primary beverage year-round, winter saw increased consumption of ale, a lightly fermented, low-alcohol drink that provided both calories and a mild warming sensation. Medieval small beer or ale wasn't primarily consumed for intoxication, clarifies medieval brewing historian Dr. Richard Unger. With alcohol content often below 3%, it was a source of calories, B vitamins, and importantly for winter, a sense of warming comfort. The brewing process made the water safer to drink, while the grain provided nutrition. For a peasant facing a cold night's work, a mug of warm ale represented both sustenance and momentary comfort. For many peasant families, domestic animals provided another crucial layer of defense against nighttime cold. Beyond the livestock kept for agricultural purposes, smaller animals often shared the human living space. Dogs and cats were valued not just for their working abilities, hunting vermin or protecting property, but for their body heat. Archaeological evidence shows that some dogs were allowed to sleep with human family members, providing mutual warmth. The medieval relationship with domestic animals was more practical than sentimental, explains zoo archaeologist Dr. Terry O'Connor. But that doesn't mean there wasn't affection. The winter months particularly reveal how intertwined human and animal lives were. A dog sleeping across the feet or a cat curled against someone's body provided valuable warmth through the night. This practical relationship extended to wild animals as well. Medieval peasants had an intimate knowledge of animal behavior and would observe which natural materials provided the best insulation. Bird nests were studied for their construction techniques. The seasonal adaptations of local wildlife provided clues about which plants offered the best insulation properties or which natural shelters might protect from wind. There's evidence that some bedding materials were specifically selected based on observations of animal nesting habits, notes ethnozoologist Dr. Mark Brenner. Materials like certain mosses or specific types of dried grasses were prized for bedding because peasants had observed local animals preferentially selecting these same materials for winter nests. The microclimates within medieval villages were also carefully managed. Houses were typically clustered together rather than spread out, creating communal windbreaks. In many regions, homes were oriented to maximize sun exposure, with fewer windows on northern walls and more openings facing south. Hedgerows and walls were strategically placed to redirect winter winds away from dwellings and working areas. Medieval village layouts weren't random, explains landscape historian Dr. Tom Williamson. They represent centuries of environmental adaptation. The seemingly organic clustering of buildings created deliberate sun traps and wind shadows. These design principles evolved through generational observation of how slight changes in positioning or orientation could yield significant temperature differences. This sophisticated environmental awareness extended to personal adaptations. As well, medieval peasants mastered what modern survival experts call microclimate management, the art of creating and maintaining smaller pockets of warmth within a colder environment. Personal practices like cupping hands over mouth and nose while sleeping to warm inhaled air or curling the body into a heat-conserving ball became instinctive winter behaviors. The medieval body itself was an adaptation, explains historical physiologist Dr. Kathleen Morris. Evidence suggests that people who lived in perpetually cold environments developed physiological differences, slightly more efficient circulation to the extremities, marginally higher metabolic rates, and possibly even differences in fat distribution that favored survival in cold conditions. These biological adaptations were supported by behavioral ones. Medieval texts describe specific sleeping positions for cold weather, often suggesting that the youngest and oldest family members sleep in the middle of the communal bed where they could benefit from surrounding body heat. Expectant mothers were given special consideration, with optimal sleeping positions and extra coverings acknowledged as crucial for both maternal and fetal survival. Despite these layered strategies, winter remained deadly. Demographic studies of medieval parish records show clear seasonal mortality patterns, with death rates spiking during extremely cold periods. The very young and very old were particularly vulnerable. In the harshest years, winter could claim 10–15% of a community's most vulnerable members. These weren't just statistics to medieval communities, explains historical demographer Dr. Helen Wrigley. Each loss represented a known individual, a grandparent, an infant, a neighbor. The communal experience of winter loss created powerful cultural narratives around cold and darkness that persist in European folklore to this day. Indeed, the psychological weight of winter emerges clearly in medieval literature and religious writings. Winter is consistently portrayed as a time of testing, of endurance, and sometimes of supernatural danger. Folk beliefs across Europe associated the winter darkness with increased spiritual peril. Many winter festivals involved rituals specifically designed to ward off malevolent forces, believed to be more powerful during the long nights. Medieval people didn't separate physical survival from spiritual security, explains folklore specialist Dr. Maria Vasquez. The techniques for surviving winter's cold were entangled with practices meant to ensure spiritual protection. A blessed candle wasn't just light and warmth, it was spiritual defense. Specific prayers before sleep weren't just religious devotion, they were psychological comfort in the dangerous darkness. This spiritual dimension of winter survival manifested in physical objects as well. Archaeological excavations of medieval peasant homes occasionally reveal protective charms built into hearths or placed near sleeping areas, small carved figures, unusual stones, or symbols etched into structural beams. These represented another layer of perceived protection against winter's dangers. These aren't simply superstitions to dismiss, notes Dr. Vasquez. They were part of a holistic survival strategy that addressed both physical and psychological needs. The medieval peasant didn't separate practical heating techniques from spiritual protection. Both were essential parts of making it through until morning. As medieval Europe moved toward the early modern period, heating technology gradually evolved. By the 14th and 15th centuries, some peasant homes in certain regions had begun incorporating enclosed stone or brick hearths with primitive chimneys instead of the earlier open fire pits. These new constructions offered more efficient heating with less smoke, though they remained far from universal. The transition from central hearths to wall fireplaces proceeded unevenly across Europe, explains technological historian Dr. Jean-François Belhoste. Economic factors, available building materials, local traditions and climate conditions all influenced adoption rates. Some regions maintained central hearth traditions well into the early modern period, while others embraced chimney technology much earlier. This technological shift coincided with other developments. Slowly, livestock began to be housed in separate structures rather than sharing human living space. This shift partly reflected evolving agricultural practices, but it removed a crucial heat source from peasant homes. In compensation, bedding and clothing technology continued to advance. Improved spinning and weaving techniques produced denser, warmer textiles that enhanced cold weather survival. The separation of humans and animals created new heating challenges, notes Dr. Belhoste. We see compensatory adaptations in home construction, smaller room sizes, more interior walls, improved ceiling around doors and windows. The longhouse with integrated animal quarters had been an elegant solution to winter heating. Without animal heat, architecture had to evolve. These architectural evolutions accelerated as medieval society transformed into early modern Europe. The increasing availability of glass allowed for windows that admitted light without sacrificing as much heat. Improved metallurgy led to more efficient cooking and heating implements. Gradually, prosperity increased for some segments of the peasantry, allowing for improved housing and winter preparedness. Yet for many, winter remained a dire threat well beyond the medieval period. In some regions of Europe, peasant housing conditions changed remarkably little between the 15th and 18th centuries. Traditional survival techniques persisted alongside gradual technological improvements. There's a remarkable continuity in basic winter survival strategies from the medieval period through early modern Europe and even into the 19th century in some regions, explains rural historian Dr. Robert Hansen. The fundamental challenges of keeping warm with limited resources remained similar, even as specific technologies evolved. This continuity underscores the effectiveness of medieval solutions. Many winter survival techniques developed or refined during the Middle Ages proved so successful that they persisted for centuries. Box beds remained common in northern Europe into the 19th century. Communal sleeping arrangements outlasted the medieval period by hundreds of years in many regions. Traditional thatch continued to insulate rural homes well into the industrial age. Medieval peasants developed winter survival systems through centuries of trial and error, notes Dr. Hansen. What emerged wasn't primitive, it was optimized. These techniques represented the most effective possible solutions given the available materials and technology. That's why so many lasted long after the medieval period itself had ended. Today, as we face our own environmental challenges, there's renewed interest in these medieval technologies. Modern sustainable building designers have rediscovered the insulating properties of thatch, straw bale, and cob construction. The concept of the centralized hearth as a home's focal point has re-emerged in contemporary architecture. The medieval principle of working with rather than against local climate conditions informs today's passive solar design. Medieval peasants were not simply surviving winter. They were practicing sustainable living by necessity, explains environmental architect Sophia Wendell. Their heating solutions required minimal external energy inputs, utilized locally available renewable materials, and focused on conservation rather than consumption. These principles are exactly what we're trying to return to in green building today. The medieval approach to winter was holistic, addressing physical, social, psychological, and spiritual needs through interconnected practices. No single technology or technique made survival possible. Rather, it was the layered combination of adaptive architecture, managed resources, community support, and accumulated knowledge that allowed peasants to endure winter after winter. The medieval peasants' approach to winter challenges us to think differently about resilience, concludes environmental historian Dr. Paul Ward. Their survival wasn't based on abundant resources or advanced technology. It was built on intimate environmental knowledge, community interdependence, and remarkable adaptability. As we face our own environmental uncertainties, these medieval lessons in resilience become increasingly relevant. As another winter night falls across the medieval landscape, a family banks the precious fire, arranges their shared bedding, pulls in closer together, and prepares to endure until morning. Dogs settle at their feet. The livestock shifts in the adjoining space. Outside, temperatures plummet toward deadly levels, but inside, through a sophisticated combination of technology, knowledge, and community, survival remains possible. They've made it through 1,000 such nights before. They'll make it through this one too. The icy fingers of dawn will eventually break the darkness. The family will rise, rekindle the banked fire, and begin another day in their ongoing relationship. With winter, a relationship defined not simply by endurance, but by ingenuity, adaptation, and the remarkable human capacity to create warmth even in the coldest circumstances. This is how they survived the coldest nights, not merely by enduring them, but by mastering them through generations of accumulated wisdom and a deep understanding of how to live within rather than against the natural world they inhabited.